Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Lamed Daled. We're going to start our daf with a review of yesterday's daf, and then we're going to correct the last part that we read. I'm going to reread it better because I didn't read it correctly yesterday. So we saw in the Mishnah, and there was no blood. Ksherim, and not only are they ksherim, even if there's no blood, right? Then they cannot contract impurity because they're not susceptible to impurity if no blood got on them. Rabbi Shimon has a different approach. We're going to leave that aside right now. Then the Gemara says this is only if no blood came out. But if blood came out, then the blood would make the meat susceptible to impurity. And then you couldn't touch it with your hands. Now, what's the issue touching it with your hands? In laws of impurity, hands are second degree impurity. The rabbis declared that all hands touch lots of things. We're going to say, if you didn't wash your hands, they have second degree impurity. And that's going to make the meat into what we call third degree impurity, a shlishi. What's the problem? The problem is there is no such thing as shlishi by Chullin. And the Gemara proved in 4 ways that we can't be talking about sacrificial items here, kachim. So the fact that it's Chullin now creates this big problem, the inference from the Mishnah makes no sense. To which they say 3 possible answers. We started with maybe they're Maser Sheni, and according not to Rabbi Meir, but according to the rabbis who disagree with him, Maser Sheni you could have a Shlishi and Maser Sheni, and again, it was bought with Maser Sheni money. Or Rav Papa said, it's your hands are Rishons. Okay, and it's a case where the rabbis decreed that your hands are going to be a rishon, so there's that option, and then we said, and that's according to specifically Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and then we had a whole deal, and then we said, what about saying it's Rabbi Akiva? But putting that aside, then we started with the third answer, and the third answer is going to say that maybe what we're talking about is Chullin that you treated like Kodesh. Okay, now what does that mean? So there were groups of people. Right? Imagine like a club that you belong to. And different clubs of people treated their items as if they were either Truma or Kodesh. There's 2 groups of people we're going to talk about today. Some, they treat their Chullin like their Taharata Truma, and some like their Taharata Kodesh. Okay, what does that mean? Well, Truma, right, people keeping the Kohanim had to be very careful. It couldn't even come in contact with a Sheni. Sheni would make it into a Shlishi. And if it's kachim, it could go to shlishi and revi'i. Kachim is all sacrificial items. Now, just as some preparatory information, if you treat your chullin like it's truma, or if you treat it like kaddish, why would you do that? Well, if you're a kohen and most of your food is truma, then it makes sense to treat your chullin like it's truma. Why to treat it like kodesh is a bit more extreme and only like unique, people who wanted to be extra careful about things did that, but most people didn't eat kachim most of the time. So a Taharata Truma is a much more common case. This will have one relevance in the shir later. So I'm mentioning that. And Kodesh is much less common. Okay? Now, what we're going to have here is, the Gemara says, again, Rabbi Elazar, B'Shem Rabbi Yoshaya says, what we're talking about here is Chullin shenasu al Taharata Kodesh. And then, if you treat your Chullin like Kodesh, you could have a case of a Shlishi. Because then we could say, if your hands are impure, don't touch that meat if it's chullin that you treat like kodesh. Okay, we'll see later why they don't say like truma. Okay, but right now they say like kodesh, and then they point out, and this is going to be the big main topic of today, udilo ki Rabbi Yoshua. I'm going back to Lamed Gimel Lamed Bet toward the bottom, okay, about 8 lines from the bottom, but not like Rabbi Yoshua. And now we're going to talk about this Mishnah. It actually said Titania, it's really a Mishnah in Tarot. And we're going to see these 2 approaches. And mostly we're going to focus today on Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yoshua's approach. We're not going to focus on Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Ha'ochel ocha rishon, rishon sheni, sheni shlishi, shlishi. Now, what we're talking about here is, what if I decide that let's go back for a second. Before we get into this, we have to explain, and this is what I neglected to explain yesterday, which is very important, is that there's something called tum'at gvia. Okay, what does that mean? It means a body can become impure based on a rabbinic decree, which is that if I eat something, I become tameh. Okay, I carry a level of impurity by eating. Now, normally that's not the case, other than the ve'la rov tahor, which is a unique case. But the rabbis made a gzera. Why did they make this gzera? Because if I had, let's say, I eat something that's tameh, okay? If I eat something impure, the rabbis decreed I'm impure because they were worried, what if at the same time I drank some wine that was truma wine? And then when I drank the wine, what happened? the truma gets mixed up in my mouth because the liquids and the solids mix, is going to get mixed up with the food that's impure that's in my mouth. And then what happens? You ruin the truma in my mouth. The truma becomes disqualified. So we don't want that situation to happen. So what they say, if you eat tamei food, you're impure. And this gets you away from doing that. In other words, this prevents you from eating tamei food at the same time as your truma, because if you immediately become impure, you won't be eating truma. So that's why they decree this impurity. Now the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is what level of impurity? So Rabbi Eliezer basically says if you eat a rishon, you become a rishon, you eat a sheni, you become a sheni, you eat a shlishi, you become a shlishi. Okay, very simple. Rabbi Yeshua says no. He complicates matters a little bit in a few ways. He says ochel rishon, v'sheni, sheni. If you eat a rishon or a sheni, you become a sheni. Why is that? Because he doesn't. Okay, now you could have said rishon, sheni, sheni. Why does he say both of them are shenis? Well, according to him, let's think about it. The whole issue is, what if you eat truma? Well, if you're a rishon or a sheni, it doesn't matter. Either way, you're going to ruin truma. So he doesn't even need, the rabbis didn't need to make you into a rishon if you ate rishon food. As long as they say you're a sheni, then if you eat sheni food, right? If you eat truma, you won't eat truma, because if you're a sheni, you can't eat truma. So a sheni is sufficient. Okay, so he goes with a rishon or a sheni, you become a sheni. Shlishi, if you eat a shlishi, you become a sheni lekodesh ve'en sheni letruma. Now what this means is, you're a sheni and you can't eat kodesh, okay, you can't eat sacrificial items, or if you touch, okay, let's just even go with touching. If I become a rishon, if I touch food, I'll make it a sheni. If I'm a sheni, if I touch food, I'll make it a shlishi. Right? That's the whole idea. I won't eat truma if I'm a sheni because I won't be able to touch, right? I won't be able to touch truma. Now, if I eat food that's a shlishi, okay, what they say is I'm sheni lekodesh, but I'm not sheni for a truma. It jumps me up a level while I have the shlishi in my mouth. Now, you can see why. Because if the whole concern is mixing it, why is it only for kodesh and not for truma? Because the concern is mixing it in my mouth. Now, if a shlishi comes in contact with truma, it doesn't do anything to it because there is no revi. So if I have truma in my mouth, it won't matter. And that's why I become a sheni for kodesh, which basically just means I'm going to disqualify the kodesh. But, if I had kodshim in my mouth, it would ruin it. But it's not a problem for truma. Okay, that's what he says. Then he points out that this is bechulin shenasu al tarata truma. This is only for chulin that were treated like their truma. Now, the Gemara says, al tarat truma in, al tarat kodesh lo. Kasaval, chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh leit behu shlishi. Now he claims that what? It's only if I treat things like truma. But if I treated things like kodesh, and then I ate this food, right, that was a shlishi, nothing's going to happen to me. Okay? Why? So here's the big question, right? He's going to basically say, now this is, again, what's happening here is fascinating. The rabbis declared that if I treat things on Tarat HaKodesh or Tarat HaTruma, and I eat food, right now, let me even go back to the bigger question. The real question here, and this is what I really didn't mention yesterday, is how do we have a case of food that's a shlishi? Okay, that's really the question. Why? Well, if I have, where does shlishi get passed down to? Shlishi gets passed down to truma and kodshim. Now, if I have a case of shlishi food that I'm eating, assuming I'm allowed to eat it, otherwise, right now, if it's truma, I have to burn it. If it's kodshim, I have to burn it because it's ruined, right? That's impure, and it's kodshim, they're impure, right, or burnt. So, what's this shlishi that I'm eating? So they're assuming, how could I have ochel shlishi? Now, when I eat this ochel shlishi, it's going to have relevance only if I treat things al tarata truma. It doesn't have relevance if I treat them al tarata kodesh. Why is that? Because the rabbis didn't decree, the rabbis said, it's very fascinating, I could do the same thing. I could eat this food that was chulin shenasu al tarata truma or tarata kodesh, and we're going to differentiate and say that it's only relevant if what? If I did it and treated it as truma. Because, what did I tell you before? Truma is the biggest, broadest community, right? The more people did it for truma. So there were gozer that this is going to be effective, my intent. But for my chulin, right? Because really there is no such thing as a shlishi. It's just, right, if I took this, let's say this glass, this is wine, okay, let's assume. And what's in this glass is wine, and I treat it like truma or kodesh, even though it's not, right? Is that effective or not? So Rabbi Yeshua, again, he doesn't say that. He just says this is chulin shenasu al taharat kodesh, okay? Al taharat truma. But he doesn't say that this is effective for truma shenasu al taharat kodesh, okay? And again, the reason is, okay, just one second. Right. He thinks that basically it doesn't really become a shlishi if you treat it like kodesh. Because the rabbis didn't take that, they didn't think that was, it was just so rare that people do that. They didn't think it's really effective. So it's not really a shlishi. So there is no shlishi al taharat kodesh according to Rabbi Yeshua, which means that if we go back to the Mishnah and we say the Mishnah is talking about meat that got susceptible to impurity and then I touched it and it was chulin that we've done al taharat kodesh, there's no shlishi there. Okay? There's no problem there. So that can't be Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. That's the basic idea. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. We'd rather this fit according to everybody. So why don't you just say the Mishnah is talking about chulin that were treated like truma, and then it would work with Rabbi Yeshua. That sounds pretty reasonable, right? Let's just say, if Rabbi Yeshua thinks that it is effective, there is such a thing as a shlishi, when I treat it like truma, then why don't we just say the Mishnah is talking about that? So the obvious answer why it's not. Lo sakadata, the katani basal, the ibetruma basar miika. If I treat all my chulin like truma, what chulin are we talking about? We're talking about chulin that theoretically could be truma. Truma is only produce, things that grow from the ground. It's not meat. And our Mishnah is talking about meat. Meat could be kachim, but meat can't be truma. So that's why the Mishnah didn't, that's why the answer that Rabbi Elazar, in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya, gave was not chulin shenasu al taharat truma, because that wouldn't be effective for meat at all. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. You're saying it has to be something that could be truma, or if we're going to say it's kodesh, could be kodesh, but there's something in the Mishnah that can't be kodesh either, because the elamai b'kodshim, you're going to say, okay, so it's talking about chulin that were treated like kodesh, and it affects meat. Okay, that makes sense. But chaya b'kodshim miika. The Mishnah talked about be'ema, chaya, and of. Now, be'emot and ofot can be korbanot. Chayot, undomesticated animals, can't be korbanot. So there is no such thing as a chaya in korbanot. So they're going to say basar b'basar michlaf, basar b'peri lo michlaf. No. If I treat all my chulin in my house as if they're kodesh, I'm going to even treat my meat that's chaya meat, that comes from, let's say, deer, I'm going to treat as if it's kodesh as well, because the whole issue is, am I going to confuse, right? And then my kodshim, I'm going to maybe make mistakes about. So I'm just going to treat everything as if it's kodesh and have everything go to fourth degree of impurity. I'm going to do it with all my meat, even if it's chaya meat, because you can't exactly differentiate between this piece of steak and that cut of steak and which one is which. So that's fine. So in the end, we're back to saying our Mishnah. We're back to explaining Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya's position, that our Mishnah fits specifically with Rabbi Eliezer, not with Rabbi Yeshua. And the Mishnah is talking about a case, there could be a shlishi in a case where I treat my chulin like they're kodesh. Okay? But it doesn't fit with Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua doesn't think that he thinks that if I treat my stuff as if it's kodesh, it doesn't go to shlishi. Okay? There's no shlishi there. So Amar Ula. But that's really going to be a source of debate. What does Rabbi Yeshua really hold? Now remember, this was all from an inference, because after Rabbi Yeshua explained what you eat makes you right a shlishi, makes me a sheni for kodesh, that's only in what case? Only if my chulin were al taharat truma. Now he doesn't say the word only. He just says it's in a case where I treated my chulin like truma. So Amar Ula, Chevraya Amrin, my friends, the group said, or my friend, we're going to see who it is soon, or we're going to make an assumption who it is. Bechulin shenasu al taharat kodesh udelo Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, that's what we just said. Ve'ana amina, but I say Rabbi Yeshua. I think it's Rabbi Yeshua also. You can explain it also like Rabbi Yeshua. How so? V'loma baya kamar. Why did Rabbi Yeshua say chulin shenasu al taharat truma? Well, it's a loma baya structure, meaning you don't even need to say, of course, if you treated your kodesh, al taharat kodesh, it would be the case, you would be a shlishi, right? This would be a shlishi. there could be shlishi food, and then if you eat it, you become a sheni for kodesh. But even if I only treat it al tarat truma, the lower level, right? Even so, that's the bigger chidush, as we say. So let's read it. And we'll explain. Lo mabaya chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh. Now, why would that be more obvious? Okay. A few minutes ago, we said it's less obvious because it's less people, so we could think the rabbis maybe didn't think that it was effective what you did. You thought you treated it like kodesh, but it's not really effective. It's not really called a shlishi. You can be very careful and all that, but it's not going to actually. I just want to make it really clear here. I can be careful and I can make sure that things don't go to shlishi, revi, all that. No matter what, I could do whatever I want. But in the world of halacha, like it's completely ineffective. That's the way we understood Rabbi Yeshua. If I do it as truma, I can make this wine into a shlishi, right? Like let's say my piece of meat is a sheni, touches this wine becomes a shlishi. It is, because I decided, even though it's chulin, I decided it's going to be and it becomes a shlishi. But if I treat myself like kodesh, the rabbis say, I could treat this, I could say it's a shlishi. But actually, it's not, okay? The rabbis said, I could do whatever I want, but there's zero effectiveness of my action. This wine, not a shlishi. So, if it's truma, and we say it's effective, and I drink it, then I become a sheni. And now, what am I a sheni for kodshim? Okay, because we're not really worried this shlishi wine is going to mix in my mouth with truma, because it won't do anything to truma, because shlishi has no effect on truma. But if I put it in my mouth and it's kodesh, right, and if I put it in my mouth and it's a shlishi, because I treated it like truma, and that's effective, and it mixes with kodshim, it will ruin the kodshim, because kodshim have 4th degree impurity. But if we say, like Rabbi Yeshua, like we thought Rabbi Yeshua, that when I make this wine, if this wine touches meat and I treat it like kodesh, this is going to be a shlishi. I could claim it's a shlishi, but it's actually not a shlishi. The rabbis didn't really accept what I'm doing. I could do it. It's fine. I could do whatever I want. But halachically, this isn't a shlishi. So if I drink it, it has no effect. Okay? That's the way we understood Rabbi Yeshua. Because the rabbis just said, oh, we're not gozer on that kind of stuff. But according to Ula, he meant, no, if I treat it like kodesh is more severe. Obviously, it goes to 4th degree impurity. So if kodesh is more severe, right? Of course, ibu shlishi. Of course, this is going to become a shlishi because kodshim is so severe that if I treat my chulin like they're kodesh, of course it'll be effective. The chidush is even elafilu chulin shenasu tarata truma, which is more lenient because it only has 3rd degree impurity. We're still ibu shlishi. There is going to be this wine, if it touches meat, that's 2nd degree impurity, or anything really, 2nd degree impurity, it will become a shlishi. Okay? So, 2 approaches here, and this is really what we're going to discuss most of the day, which is these 2 approaches. When Rabbi Yeshua said, it's in truma, it's in chulin, shenasu al tarata, truma that were treated like truma, did he mean only? Or did he mean, obviously, in addition to ones that were done in kodesh? Now, once you say it includes ones that are done in kodesh, then our Mishnah is actually, the way we explain our Mishnah, that it's chulin shenasu al tarata kodesh, and that's why the inference is, well, don't touch it with your hands because it'll turn it into a shlishi, can be according to Rabbi Yeshua as well. Okay. Now what we want to know is, as I mentioned before, Man Chevraya, who is this friend of Ula that said, that disagreed with him and thought that Rabbi Yeshua said it only in a case of Tarata Truma. Rabbi Bar Chana. Okay, it's Rabbi Bar Chana actually in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. De'amar Rabbi Bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan. Now, he's going to make this statement. It's a long statement. He's going to go and say what was the back and forth discussion going on between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and then we're going to, this is kind of an aside, we're going to go into this whole debate between them, and we're going to have why each one says, I said this, and why didn't you say that, and why didn't you agree with me, and you seem to be wrong, and all that. This back and forth argument between them. The only thing that's important for us, and it's all important because it helps us understand their approaches better, but the only thing that's relevant for us is the last line. We're bringing this for the last line, so you'll have to wait patiently. It comes at the end of the daf, at the end of the amud, the end of this amud, which is, at the end of Amud Aleph, which is this line that's going to show, that this statement is going to show that Rabbi Bar Chana, who says this, that this was the discussion between them, clearly Rabbi Yeshua only said it in Truma and not Kodesh. Okay, someone who doesn't treat it like Kodesh. Someone who treats it like Kodesh, it won't be relevant for. Maya Hadru Rabbi Eliezer for Rabbi Yeshua lahadati. So this statement that Rabbi Chana made in the name of Rabbi Yochanan is, what did Rabbi Eliezer say to Rabbi Yeshua? Okay, and what did they each say to each other? Amalo Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Yeshua. Matzinu ochel chamor min ha'ochel. He says, look, I'm going to show you. What does he say? Rishon, right? According to him, let's talk about the first disagreement. According to Rabbi Eliezer, Rishon is Rishon. Remember, you are what you eat. So it's always the same. According to Rabbi Yeshua, a Rishon, someone who eats a Rishon becomes a Sheni. It goes down in level. So comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says, Rabbi Eliezer says, I think it's equal. You think it goes down a level. But I'm going to show you that the one who eats is more stringent than the actual item they ate. And where do we get that from? And then how could you go down a level? Okay, in other words, he actually doesn't go up a level, Rabbi Eliezer, but he says, at least it should be the same, if not more. And you're actually making it lower. Where is the person who eats more chamor from the food itself? The ilu nevela of tahol, okay, very famous deen about a nevela of tahor. Normal nevela is a dead animal, passes on impurity by touching. But if you have a bird that's a kosher bird, the dead carcass of a kosher bird is bachutz lo matame, actually doesn't have impurity if it touches something. Outside what? Outside the mouth. Okay, now we're going to see the ilu ochla, when a person eats it, the person becomes impure. So it has no impurity outside. When you eat it, it has impurity. And it's mitame begadim abeda blia. While you're eating it, right, your clothes become impure. Because you're impure, that makes your clothes impure. So, if that's the case, you see that when you eat it, it's more severe than if you don't eat it. If it's on the ground, it's nothing. So, how can we at least not make the person who eats it at least equal to the food? So that's why he says, Rishon, Sheni, Sheni, right? You eat a Rishon, you're a Rishon. You eat a Sheni, you're a Sheni. Rabbi Yeshua, what does he say? Okay, the obvious answer, which is, Midavei Larov Tahor Lo Gamrina and Chidushu. That whole deen of Midavei Larov Tahor is a weird law, right? And it's unique, completely unique. So that's just a completely unique law. Don't learn a precedent from a completely unique law. Ela Matzinu, and now he proves the opposite. Shama achal chamor min ha'ochel. I'll show you the food is more strict than the person who eats, than the eater. Why? De'ilu ma'achal bekibetza. Now, for something to pass on impurity, or to become impure from food, the food has to have a kibetza. It has to have an egg bulk. Ve'ochel ad achil kechatzi pras. Now, I didn't tell you this yet before, but now we're going to see. That what did I say? When you're eating food, this whole deen of Chuma Kaviyah, that while I'm eating, I become impure, it has to be that I ate a chatzi pras, which is 2 egg bulks. Okay? So that's double the amount. So what do you see here? You're going to become impure much quicker from the food than you will from eating. Because eating, you need a larger requisite amount to actually become impure. So how could you say that the person eating is like the food? It goes down from the size of the requisite amount, and that means, obviously, well, not necessarily obviously, that's what we're going to see in a minute, according to Rabbi Yeshua, that means we're going to be more strict with the food than with the person. And that's why I go down from Rishon to Sheni. You eat a Rishon, you become a Sheni. Rabbi Eliezer, what's he going to respond to that? Chuma mishurim lo gamrina. The requisite amount has nothing to do with the level of severity. Each requisite amount is its unique reason why that's the requisite amount. Don't learn from there that, the food is more severe than the eater. Ve'od, and furthermore, lidvarecha. Okay, now, comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says, according to your theory, something doesn't work. Now, I specifically only took the example of Rishon becomes a Sheni. But now he comes and says, but wait, if you think it goes down in level, why do you say then a Sheni is also a Sheni? If you eat a Sheni, you become a Sheni. I get that according to your theory, a Rishon becomes a Sheni, because it goes down a level. But Sheni Lama. Why does a Sheni become a Sheni? Again, all the more so we're going to ask in a minute. Why, if you eat a Shlishit, you become a Sheni? That's even going up a level. Okay, but let's start with the Sheni. So Amar Lo, Rabbi Yeshua says to him, Matzinu shasheni as a Sheni al yidei mashkin. There's a precedent for Sheni making a Sheni, and that's why I said Sheni does a Sheni. What's the precedent? If I have 2 pieces of meat next to each other, one is a Sheni, one is nothing. Now, the one that's nothing has liquid on it. And because of the liquid, we're going to talk about this in a minute, Chumat Mashkin, what happens? It's like liquid is a conductor, and liquid ups a level. Okay, there's a gzera the rabbis made. Okay, there's a lot of gzerot in Tumah on liquids. Now, what happens? The meat, that's a sheni, touches this other meat which is wet. So the liquid on the wet meat becomes a rishon because the sheni meat touched it. And then well, since the liquid's on top of the other meat, since the liquid became a rishon, it's like conducting, right? It basically lifts up to a rishon and makes the meat a sheni. So what do you see here? Two pieces of meat right next to each other. You can have a case where the sheni makes the other meat into a sheni. So therefore, he says, that's a precedent for my love. You eat a sheni, you become a sheni. So Amar Lo. So he says to him, Rabbi Eliezer says that doesn't make any sense, your theory, because that's not a sheni making a sheni. What did I explain? The mashkin, the liquid, became a rishon, and that was what passed on the impurity. Ha-mashkin nami tchila havu. The mashkin were a rishon. It's not that the meat made the meat a sheni. The meat made the meat a sheni because of the liquid, which became a rishon. So, ditnan, how do we know this? Because it says, kol posel betruma, okay, which is anything that disqualifies truma, which is a sheni, mitame mashkin liotchila, turns liquid into a rishon. Okay, it's a big chumrah in tumah, that your liquid becomes a rishon, chutz mitful yom, other than a tful yom. A tful yom doesn't. Okay, but everyone else, any other kind of, because the tful yom already went to the mikvah, I'm not going to get into everything today, okay? But the idea being that mash can become a rishon, it's not a sheni making a sheni, it's a sheni making a rishon that makes a sheni. So you can't learn from there to our case, which is you eat sheni, you become a sheni. So comes Rabbi Yeshua and he answers, this is the final line, Amar lo, af ani lo amarti ela betruma, shetarata tumahi etzel hakodesh. This is a very hard line to understand from just reading it, but I will explain what he means. First of all, when he says, I only said it by truma, what he means is, I only said what I said about a shlishi. One second. Sorry, I skipped a line. That was the problem. Ve'od, I knew I was skipping something. I skipped four words. Ve'od, and secondly, he says to him, what about shlishi sheni lama? How did you make a shlishi turn into a sheni? And that's the question that Rabbi Yeshua is going to respond to. Okay? He says, I understand, right? Rishon becomes a sheni, goes down a level. Sheni, I don't really get because it's the same level. And Rabbi Yeshua tried to prove it, but he rejected it. And shlishi, b'sheni, how do you go up a level according to you? You always say the eater goes lower, not higher. So how do you get from shlishi to sheni? He says, shlishi to sheni, don't question me with that. Because I only said that, ela b'truma, what he means is, only in chulin shenasu al tarata truma. Here's our line. He says, I only said a shlishi becomes a sheni in things that were eaten al tarata truma, not al tarata kodesh. Okay? So that's his response. Okay, now we're going to explain his response in a minute, but that is what we're looking for. According to Rabbi Bar Chana, who quotes Rabbi Yochanan saying this, Rabbi Yeshua was very clear that he only says it in chulin shenasu al tarata truma and not al tarata kodesh, which proves that Rabbi Bar Chana, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, is the one who Ula quoted as, my friend said this, but I disagree. Because remember, he thinks it's also in Tarata Kodesh. Now, what is he saying? Why is it only in Tarata Truma? Now we're going to understand. He said it's only if you treat things in Tarata Truma because Taharata Tumahi Etzel HaKodesh. What does this mean? Well, this actually comes up somewhere else. That if I am very careful in my house because of Truma. Okay, we live in a family of Kohanim. Because there's Truma around, we're always very careful. Now, what does it mean to be careful? Well, there's all sorts of things. Like if a nida sits on a bench, the bench becomes right on something, like a cloth that's sitting on a bench, that becomes impure, touches something else, right? It's an avatuma, can make a rishon, can make a sheni. Okay, there's constant tuma floating around, like opportunities for tuma. So people who are very careful about truma, right, are very careful, basically. They're always watching out. But for kodesh, it requires a more severe level of protection. Like you might miss things, okay? We assume you keep a certain level of checking, but you have to be with eyes, all around your head to be able to follow all the possible tumor situations that could go on. You could need, right, like I was thinking, my daughter has a checklist in her apartment of who's home at what given time, right? So sometimes people don't sleep there, so just to know, like, okay, I'm in the apartment, right? So you can imagine everyone who comes to your house needs to go a checklist. I'm tameh. I touch this. I touch that, right? It's hard to keep track of all that. So I'm going to say it's like this. The level we keep for truma is a certain level. But if you want to eat kachim, that's not a good enough level. You have to really protect yourself if you're going to eat kachim much more severely. So what does that mean? If I say, okay, so now I have this food. That's a shlishi. Why is it a shlishi? Because I treated it al tarata truma. Okay? Now if I treated it al tarata kodesh, then we're not going to worry. Like that's not... Okay, if I treat things al tarata kodesh, we know I was super careful. But if I only treated it al tarata truma, and then I have this shlishi, right? I treated my chulin like it was truma, and now it's a shlishi. I put it in my mouth. Now we're going to understand why he said, which we didn't really understand in the beginning, it's a problem for kodesh, it's not a problem for truma. What he's basically saying is, if you want to eat kodesh, you can't do that. You're now impure when it comes to kodesh. You're going to be a sheni. He could have even said a rishon, but it doesn't matter. You're a sheni because the assumption is you didn't protect yourself at all from kodesh. To eat kodesh, you need a higher level. You didn't keep that high level? Well, stay away from kodesh. Remember, this whole thing is like, right, if you eat something, we want to keep you away from it. Stay away from kodesh. So what he said is my statement that if you eat ochel shlishi, you're going to be now. What's the issue? If I eat a shlishi, it's not going to mess me up for truma. Let's say I protect myself from truma. I can eat truma because it's a shlishi. I'm not worried something in my mouth is going to, right? But if I want to eat kodesh, what's the problem? The problem is this could be a rishon. It might not be a shlishi. It might be a rishon. It might be something that got impure and I wasn't paying attention, because for kodesh you have to keep much stricter rules. So that's why he's going to say, you're now a sheni. You shouldn't come in contact with any kodesh because maybe that was rishon. And maybe, right? Maybe you don't want anything mixing with kodesh. Okay? That's his theory. Okay. Anyway, the point being, again, that helped us understand better Rabbi Yeshua's position. But the main point being is he said, I only said it for people who keep it al tarata truma. If you keep it al tarata kodesh, and it's a shlishi, you're not going to become a sheni. You're not going to, and that really responds to Rabbi Elazar's question, you're not going to become a sheni because you don't go up in level, okay? You're not going to become a sheni if you eat shlishi, okay? Because there's no reason to go up in level for kodshim. Because you obviously kept, the worst case, what you're eating is a shlishi, and it'll come in contact with the kodesh. It'll be a reviz, so we could call you a shlishi, but we don't need to call you a sheni, okay? But he basically says, I wasn't talking about Tarat HaKodesh, okay? Then you wouldn't be a sheni, okay? Maybe you wouldn't be anything, but you're definitely not a sheni. Now, Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Asi. So now we have these two approaches. Again, this was all just to prove who's the person Ula mentioned who has this approach that we saw originally, which is when he said Al Tarat Truma, he only meant Al Tarat Truma, not Al Tarat Kodesh. So now we're going to see again two different some approaches to this. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Like I said, the whole daf is really dealing with this opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. And what did he say? Amar Rabbi Yanai. Notice again, Rabbi Yochanan is quoted here. Now, a minute ago we quoted Rabbi Yochanan as saying that Rabbi Yeshua limited himself to Tarat HaKodesh, right? Tarat HaTruma, not Tarat HaKodesh. But now he's going to say, Ha'ochel shlishi shel chulin shenasu al Tarat HaKodesh naseh gufo sheni lekodesh. What do they say? If you eat a shlishi of chulin that was treated as kodesh, this is what we thought Rabbi Yeshua didn't say, you become a sheni lekodesh, which is exactly Rabbi Yeshua, but not the way we thought. More, this matches what Ula said, which is he said it both in Tarat HaKodesh. Of course he said in Tarat HaKodesh because that's more severe, and even in Tarat HaTruma. But Eitive Rabbi Zera Rabbi Asi. Now, after Rabbi Zera quoted Rabbi Asi, you quoted this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who quoted in the name of Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Zera then goes to Rabbi Asi and says, wait, Shlishi sheni lekodesh ve'ein sheni letruma b'chulin shenasu al Tarat HaTruma. He quotes back the Mishnah that we started with, that sheni, right, the Mishnah in Tarot, that what does Rabbi Yeshua say? Sheni lekodesh ve'ein sheni letruma, and all that was done b'chulin shenasu al Tarat HaTruma. Al Tarat HaTruma in, al Tarat HaKodesh lo, and he makes the same inference we made at the beginning. So how could you say that he says it about Tarat HaKodesh? And not only that, we just quoted Rabbi Yochanan himself, right? But Rabbi Baruch is saying that Rabbi Yochanan said that it's even, right? That it's only on Tarat HaTruma also. And now we're quoting Rabbi Yochanan and saying it's both. So the answer lo mebaya kamar. Now, actually, don't read it as Tarat HaTruma specifically, and this is exactly as we commented earlier, right, when we saw Ula's opinion. Vaha afani lo amarti ela betruma ka'amar. In other words, afani lo amarti ela betruma ka'amar. In other words, what he was saying is, even in truma, this would be the case. So, how do we explain? Oh, sorry, I didn't read that right. Let's just go back for a minute. Amarle lo mebaya kamar, and they don't even explain it. They say it's a lo mebaya structure. We already know that from earlier, which is not only if you do it al Truma HaKodesh, even if you do it al Tarat HaTruma, and then he's saying both. But now the Gemara says, but how could you say that? Because veha, and now we go back to what they just quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan at the bottom of Amud Aleph, which is afani lo amarti ela betruma. I only said this in Chulin shenasu al Tarat HaTruma. So Rabbi Yochanan himself said that's how he explained Rabbi Yoshua. So how can you say that? And Morainin Uvaliva to Rabbi Yochanan. We now say, well, there's Rabbi Asi who quoted Rabbi Yochanan, and there's Rabbi Arachan who quoted Rabbi Yochanan. And there's a debate now. We're going to explain. It's a debate about how Rabbi Yochanan read Rabbi Yoshua. Okay. So again, to summarize, it's a very complicated daf, but to summarize it very succinctly until this point, and then we're just going to finish with one last thing, which is we have two approaches to what Rabbi Yoshua said. When Rabbi Yoshua said this line, that when a shlishi becomes a sheni, that's chulin shenasu tarata truma, is that only tarata truma? And like I said, this wine that I considered al tarata kodesh is really not a shlishi. I could call it a shlishi, but it's really not if I do it al tarata kodesh, because the rabbis just didn't decree, because it's such a rare case that people are going to do that. So it just doesn't have ramifications. If I drink it, I'm not going to become a sheni. Or does Rabbi Yoshua say, no, it is. This drink, I call it a shlish, right? I call it kodesh, touches a sheni, it's going to be a shlishi. And I drink it, I'm now a sheni, and I can't eat kudshim. Okay? So does it apply to both or not, right? And again, the theory of the second approach is all the more so kodesh, because kodesh is so severe, so if I treat it like that, of course it's going to have that law. Okay. That's basically what we've done. Amar Ula. But Ula comes and says now another thing. Now, until now, what did we say? Let's go back to the line of Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, it's all Rabbi Yeshua today. Shlishi, this became a shlishi because I treated it like a shlishi, right? I treated it like kodesh, or I treated it like truma, let's just say. And then, sheni came in contact with it. It's a shlishi. I drink it. I'm now a sheni for kodesh, but not for truma. So we assume that meant that, okay, I drink, right? Remember now, we're worried that maybe I'll have truma in my mouth, but we don't care because it's shlishi. It's not going to do anything for truma. So I can't eat kodesh, right? So we have to basically, if I eat kodesh in my mouth, okay, and what it means is also that if I touch, that if this becomes a shlishi, I become a sheni. So if I touch kodesh, it's going to make it impure. If I touch truma, nothing's going to happen. Because again, why they say if I touch things, they wanted me to avoid. They wanted me to get away and just say, I'm staying far away from truma, so just in case I end up eating it. But in this case, we don't have to worry about me eating truma because it's a shlishi. So truma, I can touch anything I want. Nothing's going to happen. If I touch something that's truma, it doesn't become a shlishi. If I touch kodesh, it will become a shlishi because I'm a sheni. So Amar Ula. So we assume this has nothing to do with truma at all. No effect. But comes Ula and he says, okay, I treated this like as if it was truma. So now it became a shlishi. Nifsal gufo milechol truma. While it's true, I'm a sheni only for kodesh. If I touch truma, nothing happens. But I actually am forbidden to eat truma. Okay, he claims that I can't eat truma at all. Okay, in other words, on the one hand, right, because I'm now called a sheni, and a sheni can't eat truma. Even though I can touch truma, okay, nothing's going to happen if I touch it, but I really am disqualified from eating truma. So now they're going to interestingly read this into what we saw before and then say, well, he's not really adding anything because isn't that the way you read this? Now, we didn't read it this way, but they're going to claim that you could have read it this way. My kamash malan, Tanina, why? What's he teaching us? Of course you can't eat truma. How do we know this? Okay, again, we didn't read it this way, but try to read now with a new mind. Shlishi, sheni lekodesh ve'ein sheni letruma. We're going back to that line of Rabbi Yeshua. If you drink a shlishi or eat a shlishi, right, you become a sheni for kodesh, but not for truma. Now, what does it mean, ein sheni letruma? Right, so first of all, he says, b'chulin shenasu al tarata truma, which is our case. Right, you treated the chulin as if it was truma. Now, sheni hu de lo have. Now, you don't become a sheni that you're going to touch things and mess it up. Ha shlishi have. We're going to assume you don't go up a level to sheni, but you must be a shlishi. Now, a shlishi person can't eat truma. That's just a fact. If I'm a shlishi l'tuma, okay, which again, how would I be? Well, it would be like a case like this. I am a shlishi to the extent that I can't eat truma. That's what Ula says. And now the Gemara says, well, Ula could have been inferred from that statement because when it says sheni l'kodesh, not sheni for truma, what it meant is not sheni for truma, but yes sheni for, but yes shlishi for truma. Okay, which means I can't eat truma. Now, they say, no, that inference is not necessarily the inference you would have made, which is why Ula has to tell us this. And that's what we're going to explain right now. Why is it not necessarily the inference you would have made? Ima hi hava mina lo sheni havi velo shlishi havi. If from there you would have said, no, you could say you're not a sheni and you're not even a shlishi. Now, so why did they say you're not a sheni betruma if you're not a shlishi either? Well, because I did Amr Sheni B'Kodesh, Amr Sheni B'Truma. Because you said it's Sheni B'Kodesh and not for Truma, it's saying Sheni B'Kodesh and not Sheni B'Truma, but you're not even a Shlishi either, which is actually how we read it. Right? We didn't start saying, oh, you're a Shlishi and you can't eat the Truma. So Kamash Malan. That's why Ula needed to come, because you couldn't have necessarily inferred it from there. But now we're going to have a difficulty on Ula, and we'll resolve it, and with that we'll finish our daf. Eitive Rav Hamnuna Le'Ula. Rav Hamnuna brings a difficulty on Ula and says, look at this source. Harishon shebachulin tamei ubitamei. Okay, this is just basic. In the land, this is just, I went through this yesterday, all the degrees of impurity. If you have a rishon of something that's chulin, and it's rishon l'toma, got tamei from a sheretz, let's say, it's tamei, it becomes impure, and it's mitamei, and it passes on to chulin, right, second degree impurity, and obviously the kodshim and truma. Hasheni, if it's a sheni, right, remember it doesn't go to chulin, so what does it do? It's posel. That means it disqualifies truma, because a truma that's a shlishi is completely disqualified, meaning that's the end game. It can't pass on impurity anymore to truma, but eno mitame. Okay, right? It's posel, but it's not mitame chulin. But it can disqualify, right? It can actually make kodshim tame, but it doesn't disqualify. It doesn't make chulin impure. Vashlishi ne'echal benizid hadema. Okay, this is a little bit complicated. What is this? If you have a shlishi, okay, then let's say you have food that's a shlishi, which would be what? Chulin, that you treated like kodshim or truma. You can eat it in a nizid hadema. You can eat this shlishi food. Let's say it's a stew. You can eat it with spices that are truma. Okay, you can eat a shlishi. You can mix it. You can mix in truma spices, even though it's a shlishi. Now, now, if you eat a shlishi, you can't eat truma, which is what Ula just said. How could you? Okay, now this next line is a little tricky because Rashi explains it one way and some people have issues with it. And it's not actually the main problem, but let's just read it. Safina lemidi de pasale legufe. Are you allowed to eat something that makes you disqualified to eat truma? Okay, it's really much more than that, which I'll discuss in a minute. Maybe I'll already say the bigger problem, not what these words say. But if I'm disqualified from eating truma, then how can I eat the spices? In other words, while I'm eating this stew that has shlishi in it, right? Remember, this is my wine. Let's say that I treated as if it was chulin, and then it came in contact as my chulin as if it was truma. Came in contact with meat that was a sheni. It's now a shlishi, but mixed in with this is some spices of truma. So now I eat this I drink it. While I'm drinking it, it's a shlishi, right? And then I'm eating truma at the same time. Now, if Ula said I can't eat truma, then I'm basically eating truma, right? And that's why the next words are tricky, because it's not really what the next words mean, but that's clearly what the problem is. Rashi adds here, the way he explains these words, and there's different girsa'ot, and I'm not going to get into it, but how can I eat something? Rashi thinks that there's a prohibition, even perhaps by Torah law, for me to eat something that makes me impure. Okay? That's a whole question, because it's not really, but that's why the commentaries have a big issue with Rashi. But are we going to allow me to eat something that makes me disqualified to eat truma? Okay? But the real problem, and you'll see from the answer, is how can I eat this truma? If I just ate something that made me not capable of eating truma, then how am I eating the spices of truma in this stew? So, Amar Lehi answers him, Ula answers, Hanach l'nezid hadema deleka kazai b'chtei achila pras. The amount of spices in this stew, okay, imagine this is the stew, the amount of spices in here, if I would eat a kazayit of this whole stew, okay, if I would eat the amount of time it takes to eat a pras, which is like a half a loaf of bread, so let's say the amount of this would correspond to a half a loaf of bread, there wouldn't be a kazayit in there. Okay, this is a shear that comes up in general, like to bench, you have to eat a certain amount within the time frame of kazayit, the time it takes you to eat a pras. The point being that there's not enough here to actually make this problematic, okay? Because I'm not going to end up eating a kazayit of truma, because it's just a spice, there's very little of it in this bigger stew. So because of that, it's not a problem. But if there was a kazayit of truma, I wouldn't be allowed to eat it if I was a shlishi. If I basically, if I ate a shlishi. Okay? So even though in the beginning Rabbi Yeshua said it's only sorry, I'm looking for the words. It's a sheni, a shlishi, osa sheni, likodesh, but not for truma. It means not for touching truma. But I'm a shlishi now. If I touch truma, nothing's going to happen. I'm a sheni, sorry. If I touch kodesh, it'll become a shlishi. But if I touch truma, it won't be. But I actually can't eat truma. Okay? And that, we had a difficulty on it, but we resolved it. So again, what did we do today? We started with that answer the Gemara gave, that third answer, that the Mishnah must be talking about Chullin shenasu al tarat ha-truma. I'm sorry, al tarat ha-kodesh. It's only kodesh because it's meat. It can't be truma because it has nothing to do with truma. Right? All that stuff is not stuff that would be truma that grow from the ground. It's meat mentioned in the Mishnah, so it must be al truma ha-kodesh. That doesn't correspond to Rabbi Yeshua. After we said maybe it does correspond, because maybe Rabbi Yeshua thinks not just in Tarat Truma you can have a shlishi, but you can even have a shlishi in Tarat Kodesh, and that was the basic ping pong we had in today's daf. Does he hold in both, or does he hold only in one? From there we got to Ulu, says, by the way, it's true that when you're a shlishi, you become a sheni for Kodesh and not for Truma, but you actually, that's for touching Truma. But you actually, if you eat it, you become, it's also disqualified. You can't eat Truma while you're in this sheni status for having eaten the shlishi. Okay, and with that, we finished for today. Hope that was clear. Wishing everyone a good day. Definitely a bit quite complicated daf because it's a lot of new concepts.